The last aspect of the issue of empowerment and growth that we're going to examine is the issue of maturity, because clearly there has to be a relationship between the issue of growth and the issue of maturation. In the first instance, I think it's probably appropriate to consider maturation as a process. And as the word implies, any process is concerned with an incremental move between a beginning and an end. Now, if you consider maturation from that point of view, then the process of maturation starts at the beginning, which is birth, and ends at death. Now, what's interesting about both of those moments is that they both have an absolutely unconditional character. Because clearly at birth, we've had nothing yet. So the infant at birth is yet to get in the most unconditional sense of the word. Whatever the infant is going to get, he will still get. On the other hand, when you die, you give unconditionally. Now, there is a challenge to this view, which is to say, listen, when I die, I don't give anything. Everything gets taken away from me. But then that requires us to examine the difference between giving something and having it taken from you. Let's assume I have $1,000 stolen from me, and my neighbor gives $1,000 to a charity that's going to help to educate children in Rwanda. Now, clearly, my experience of the loss of the $1,000 is that it was taken from me, and my neighbor's experience of the loss of the $1,000 is that he gave it. That distinction doesn't sit in the $1,000. It's the same object. Actually, the difference lies in the subject of the person who's going through the experience. Because my intention wasn't to give, I felt taken from. Now, if we assume that the loss of the $1,000 is like death, it's the one thing that's definitely going to happen. The question is, whose experience of the loss of the $1,000 can one describe as the successful experience, mine or the neighbor's? And clearly it's the neighbor's. Which means to say that, by definition, the process of maturation is concerned with the process of the maturation of intent to give unconditionally. The second thing that the word process implies is increments, which basically means to say that if one used a metaphor of shade, it suggests that as you mature, there's in a sense a move from dark to light by various shades of grey. And if you separate the dark and light out, then what becomes apparent is that what changes as we mature is, if you like, a change in the proportion of the mix. Now that suggests that at every moment that we're in, there's always two variables that face us. There's what we get from the world and what we give to the world. And in a sense, the more mature we are, the more frequently we respond on what we should be giving rather than what we want to get. If we see it from this point of view, then what further becomes apparent is that in the middle of this process, there's a point where there's a shift of predominantly darkness in the shade, in other words, 51% darkness in the shade, to predominantly light in the shade. That's fundamentally the difference between immaturity and maturity. Now, in the first instance, we experience the difference between immature and mature people, that immature people are basically expectation focused in how they respond to a situation, and mature people are contribution focused in how they respond to a situation. It relates to the issue of listening that we explored before. If you're able to listen to somebody, it means that you can suspend your agenda to give attention to their agenda. And you can describe giving as that quality. Now, when somebody has developed that skill of being able to suspend their agenda for the other, there's a whole lot of immediate implications to that. Let's assume you're trying to tell me something and I'm answering you back before you finish speaking. In other words, I'm giving attention to my agenda and not yours. Clearly, my agenda sits in my subject. In other words, while I'm not listening to you and answering you back, you experience me as subjective, you'll experience me as irrational, you'll experience me as reactive, and further to that, you'll probably experience me as impatient, judgmental, and narrow-minded, etc. On the other hand, when I suspend my agenda to give attention to your agenda, because your agenda sits in my object, you will experience me as objective, you'll experience me as reflective, you'll experience me as rational, you'll probably experience me as open-minded, as non-judgmental, as all sorts of things that one normally would associate with mature people. The second implication of the difference between being here to get or being here to give, that resonates with the difference between immaturity and maturity, is that immature people deal with the situation on the basis of their own needs, and mature people deal with the situation on the basis of their values. For example, the value that underlies all communication is honesty. So let's assume that you ask me about where I live and I tell you truthfully where I live. You've not demonstrated anything about my honesty at all. And the reason for this is that there's no harm to me to tell you about it. But if you, however, asked me about something that could potentially harm my own interests, and I still speak the truth, only now have you demonstrated something about my honesty. In other words, you only demonstrate that I'm an honest person when I stay honest when it is not in my interest to do so. That's the nature of value-driven behavior. When you're value-driven, you are able to act for reasons that are bigger than your self-interest. You can contradict your need in order to do what's the right thing. This suggests that there's a fundamental difference between being value-driven and being expedient. When you're expedient, you do what's going to work for you. When you're value-driven, you do what's right. When I trust you, I'm basically making an assumption, and that assumption is that when you're faced with a distinction between what's right and what's in your own interests, you'll probably do what's right. Which basically means to say that when I trust you, I view you as value-driven. I therefore consider you to be responsible, to have a long-term view of things, and the effect that you have on the world around you is constructive. On the other hand, when I think that you're only going to be expedient, that you're going to act on the basis of what's going to suit you in the situation that you're in rather than what's right, I won't trust you. I'll view you as irresponsible. I'll view you as as evidencing short-term thinking and being destructive to the world around you. This shift of intention of being here to get to being here to give has definite consequences. In the first instance, if I construct my sense of security and what makes me secure on what I'm getting from the world, because the universe rarely gives me what I want at that particular point in time, I will never be secure. If, on the other hand, I construct my sense of security on the basis of the quality of what I'm contributing at any given point in time, because I've always got power over the quality of what I'm contributing at any point in time, I will always be secure. This suggests that there's no amount of money that can make us secure. It's clearly naive. We've all met and known very wealthy people in our lives who were actually miserably insecure. The assumption that you can own enough or have enough to make you secure is fundamentally misguided. In most of the parts of the world that I've worked in, the asset that people will own, which they think makes them secure, is a home or a house. Now, it's very important to understand that when you consider something as providing you security, what you're actually thinking is that this thing stands between you and disaster, because that which makes you secure is that which protects you from catastrophe. Now, let's say, for example, I get beaten up this afternoon and I come home and I walk up to the front door of my house all bleeding. I doubt whether my house will respond in outrage. I don't think it's going to ask me who beat me so that it can protect me. In fact, my house couldn't give a brass farthing about who beat me up today. On the other hand, if I walk up to my house and I found that the neighborhood hooligans had sprayed a red X on my front door, I would definitely be annoyed. Which basically suggests what's there to look after who, or who's there to look after what. Is the house there to look after me, or am I there to look after the house? And clearly I'm there to look after the house. In other words, the house isn't my source of security, I'm my house's source of security. My house doesn't protect me, I protect it. In fact, there's a very solid argument to be made for the fact that the more things you own, the less secure you are, because the more things you have to lose. So this idea that you can be secure by owning things is fundamentally false and misguided. And while we're pursuing things in order to get a sense of security, we will stay insecure. Exactly the same logic is true for contentment and fulfillment. If my happiness is based on what I'm getting from the world, because the universe rarely gives me what I want at that particular point in time, I will rarely be contented. On the other hand, if I base my happiness on the quality of what I'm contributing at any given point in time, because I've always got power over that, I'll always be fulfilled. Further to that, if I want something from somebody else, their ability to withhold what I want gives them power over me. Let's say, for example, I want Fred's shoes. Now, clearly, Fred has got control over the shoes. In other words, while I want the shoes from Fred, Fred's ability to withhold the shoes gives him power over me. Now, let's assume that I shift my engagement with Fred from what I'm trying to get out of him to how I can be helpful to him. The moment I do that, he can't withhold the shoes, which means I slip out from underneath his ability to manipulate me. I become powerful. The reason for this is straightforward. Of the two variables, what you get from the world and what you give to the world, the only one that you actually have power over is what you're giving to the world, because your hands sit there. Your hands don't sit with the other. In other words, if you give attention to what you're giving attention to what you have power over. When you're giving attention to what you're getting, you're giving attention to what you don't have power over. So while you give attention to what you're getting, you're weak. When you give attention to what you are willing to give or lose, you become powerful. Now, this is true in absolutely every single context. It's even true in transactions. If you consider, for example, how prices get set at auctions, you'll find for a while the price is going up, and at some point the price gets stuck. It's not going to go up any further. And that actually happens when somebody said, I'm not going to pay more. In other words, the person who can lose the transaction defines the value of the transaction. The person who can't lose the transaction is obviously defined by the value of the transaction because they're still negotiable. So when you deal with the world on the basis of what you want from the world, you're weak. When you deal with the world on the basis of what you should be contributing, you become powerful. The further implication to this is the following. Let's assume I want Fred's shoes. We now know that Fred's ability to withhold the shoes gives Fred power over me. In other words, while I want the shoes from Fred, Fred is dangerous to me. However, not only is Fred dangerous to me, but precisely because I'm trying to get something out of him, I'm dangerous to him. In other words, while I want Fred's shoes, Fred is dangerous to me and I'm dangerous to him. Now, clearly, when you've got two people who are fundamentally dangerous with regard to each other, you're going to have conflict. If I shift my engagement with Fred from what I want from him to how I can be helpful to him, because he can't withhold the shoes, I slip out from underneath his ability to manipulate me. I become free and safe from Fred. However, not only am I safe from Fred, but precisely because I'm now trying to be helpful to Fred, he is safe from me. In other words, the moment I shift my attention from what I want from him to what I should be giving to him, I become safe from him and he becomes safe from me. I have harmony with Fred. In other words, these four things of security, fulfillment, power, and harmony are not the product of anything you get from the world, but they're the product of what you give to the world. When you construct your engagement with the world on the basis of the intent to give, those four things are the fruit. When you construct your engagement with the world with the intent to take, the fruit is insecurity, discontentment, weakness, and conflict.